Hello again, class. This is Professor Fisher. We are continuing on with Chapter 3, the cell. So we've talked about the chemistry of life, molecules, atoms, compounds, how they combine, physical mixtures, colloids, solutions, what atoms are made of, protons, neutrons, electrons, how they bond, covalent bonds, ionic bonds, polar covalent bonds. And now we move to the next level of organization, which is the cell. So we'll go from the chemical level, which is not considered alive, even though we talked about organic versus non-organic and things like that. And we talked about the proteins, the lipids, the, what else we talked about? Nucleotides, nucleic acids, and we talked about the, different parts of chemistry that make up the body, not considered alive, considered non-living. But now we go into the living when we talk about the cell, the smallest unit of life. So the smallest unit of matter is the atom, which is not considered alive, but helps make up life, which starts with the cell, right? Some basic things are going to occur with all cells. All cells have metabolism. Metabolism is just the summation of all the reactions that happen inside of a cell. So these are chemical reactions necessary for life. Cells generally have to transport substances, whether it's into, out of the cell. Remember, cell is a living organism. So a living, the smallest unit of life. Let me rephrase that. And so there's transporting of substances. Remember, we described something as being alive if it excretes. And so waste is, for instance, a substance that needs to be transported. Communication. Cells communicate between each other. When we get into the next chapter on tissues, we're gonna see that tissues are groups of cells working together to perform a specific function. And to perform that function, those cells need to communicate. And then reproduction. If you injure yourself, cells need to be reproduced. When cells get old and are no longer viable, no longer useful to the body, reproduction needs to occur. You need to have cellular reproduction. Okay. So metabolism, this is just further explaining some of the points I just talked about. Cell metabolism, some of all the chemical reactions. Right, so you have anabolic reactions where you build up things. You have catabolic reactions where you break down molecules in the cell. That's going back to last chapter, chemistry. You have oxidation reduction reactions where electrons are basically transferred, so you convert energy into chemical bonds into ATP, for instance. We're going to talk about that when we get into cellular respiration. Transport, I just mentioned. Communication, I mentioned. Reproduction, I just mentioned. Okay. What is the structure of a cell? Now, keep in the back of your mind that cells can be very, very different in shape, size, even their internal structure, the number of organelles, which are the parts inside of the cell. Can be very different, varying from cell to cell. For instance, red blood cells. Red blood cells are optimized to carry hemoglobin. To carry oxygen using hemoglobin in the red blood cell. So they have this heme group which can bind to oxygen, which carries hemoglobin. They are not optimized for reproduction. Therefore, you won't see the nucleus in the mature red blood cells. Therefore, they only live about 100, red blood cells only live about 100 to 120 days, and then they go to the spleen to be removed from the system, and they are replaced by new red blood cells, which are created through this process that starts in your bone marrow. So, for instance, the red blood cell will look very different from the muscle cell in the muscle cells that make up the myocytes that make up the muscle cells in your arms. Those are very different cells. They have different lifespans. They have different functions, different properties. So keep that in mind when you think of cell. Okay, so the general structure of the cell is plasma membrane, which you see here in this diagram. Plasma membrane is going to be the outside of the cell. It's the structure, so it gives the cell a shape that can be very different. Not all cells aren't all circular in structure. Some are much longer than they are wide. Some are more circular. Some are more cuboidal. We're going to see different types of cells. Cytoplasm. You have the cytoplasm, which is where all the organelles are. It contains the cytosol, the organelles, and the cytoskeleton. So that's all makes up the cytoplasm. Cytosol is like a jelly-like substance, fluid-like substance, primarily made up of water. Organelles are going to be your different structures inside the cell that help perform specific functions. We're going to mention mitochondria, which help give the cell energy. We're going to mention the endoplasmic reticulum, which are a transport system for the cell. We're also going to have, the cytoplasm, cytosol, organelle, cytoskeleton, and then we also have the nucleus. Nucleus is where we house the DNA of the cell. All right, so more information. Plasma membrane surrounds each cell, sort of like the walls of the cell, provides structure, helps with communication with other cells around it. Also cell identification, that's going to be very important. We want to know, your body has a way of knowing what cell is what. Remember, these cells don't have phone lines. They can't call and say, oh, hey, this is cell of Daryl Fisher calling cell, heart cell, whatever. So there has a way to identify cells, which we're going to talk about. And the plasma membrane also, just defines the intracellular fluid, the cytosol, so it helps define the space that the cytosol will have, and keeps it separate from what is on the outside of the cell. The cytoplasm consists of the cytosol, which is the fluid, mostly water, has dissolved solutes, proteins. You have the organelles, which are the structures inside the cell, which help the cell function. They have very specific functions. And then we have the cytoskeleton, which is like the skeleton of the cell, helps give it its structure. These are made up by protein filaments, helps the cell maintain its shape. Remember, I said different cells have different shapes, which the shape has a lot to do many times with the function of the cell. Most cells contain a nucleus, not all cells, but most cells contain a nucleus, and that's enclosed in a phospholipid bilayer. We're going to see that term phospholipid bilayer fairly frequently. So you may want to highlight, I should have probably highlighted it here, but you may want to highlight that because that's something that you're going to see. Phospholipid contains phosphorus, contains lipid. We kind of mentioned this last chapter. The plasma membrane, the outside of the cell, has a very similar structure to the nuclear envelope. Nuclear envelope is the structure that surrounds the nucleus. So very similar to the outside structure of the cell. So it's meant to enclose your DNA. Clearly, we do not want the DNA to be tampered with. We want it to be very protected because the DNA codes for the different proteins, the enzymes, everything that help the body function, right? So we want that to be protected because we don't want it to be mutated or to change. And as I mentioned earlier, the cell shape has a lot of diversity, right? So you can see red blood cells. They call this shape the biconcave disc. Nerve cells. Look at, you have the nucleus here, but you have dendritic ends and you have the axon. Epithelial cells, skin cells, right? Then we have skeletal muscle cells, multiple nuclei on a long elongated cell. Continuing on with the cell, we're going to talk about the different parts of the cell. On the outside of the cell, we have the plasma membrane made of the phospholipid bilayer, which gives our cell sort of its barrier between surrounding cells, provides a means to be able to communicate with other cells, defines the space that the cytosol can fill for the cell, also helps identify the cell. Right, so we have this phospholipid bilayer. If you remember this from chapter 2, the plasma membrane uses this structure to be able to protect the inside of the cell. So plasma membrane forms its effective barrier between the extracellular fluid, the outside, and the cytosol, which is the inside. The phospholipid bilayer is neat because it has parts that can interact with water and repel water at the same time. All right, so phospholipid, phosphorus, phospholipid, lipid tails, these hydrophobic, remember lipids, carbon chains, you have carbon chains bound to hydrogen. The phosphorus polar head. So the polar head, remember water is a polar, water H2O in and of itself is a polar, has a polar covalent bond, so goes well with things that are polar. So you have this polar head, which would go well with water, but we have these hydrophobic tails. So hydrophilic head likes water, hydrophobic tails doesn't like water. These are the lipid tails, the carbon hydrogen tails, which are not polar. So phospholipids are amphiphilic, right? The phosphate group is hydrophilic, likes water. The two fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, don't like water. So what does that produce when we have a phospholipid bilayer? So if we look at this sort of chemical experiment sort of diagram here, if we have a layer of, so we have this polar, non-polar in. If we drop in the if we drop it into water, the polar heads will face the water, right? So the polar heads face the water because they like water, and the non-polar ends will face away. But if we drop in more water, some of the polar heads will come over and face the water on the opposite end, and the tails will face each other because they're comfortable facing each other. And so you get this bilayer, right? This sort of layer in between where the water won't go through because it won't go past this non-polar end. Remember, oil and water, think of fat as like oil and water, does not mix. So we get this layer. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little confusing, but hopefully that makes sense. Right, so what does that create? We look at this, what we call the fluid mosaic model. Plasma membrane is a dynamic fluid structure with multiple components. Some have the ability to move within bilayer as phospholipids move themselves. So we have these phospholipids, these structures all throughout your plasma membrane, which, you know, so it's not completely solid on the surface of your cell, but we have this sort of layer that you know likes water on both ends, but in the middle repels water. Remember, our bodies are 60 to 80% water, so the ability to not allow too much to go through at a certain time allows it to maintain its shape and structure. And that's basically the structure of the of the plasma membrane. Now, you will see other things like peripheral proteins, integral proteins, which we're going to talk about, carbohydrates, embedded in this phospholipid bilayer, right? One of the things is membrane proteins. Main component of plasma membrane, two basic types. We have these integral proteins, integral and peripheral. Integral means it spans the entire membrane. So you'll see this integral protein here. It goes through the entire membrane of entire plasma membrane, right? So it's a protein that is on that it completely spans the length of the plasma membrane. Then we have peripheral proteins, which are on, you'll see on one end. So they're proteins involved with the plasma membrane, but they only are on one end, either the inside or the outside of the plasma membrane. Proteins can function as channels. So a protein that, membrane protein that spans the length of the plasma membrane can focus as a channel, right? So that protein, remember proteins have certain shapes based on their primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary folding. They can have certain shapes, and it can allow for certain substances to pass through the plasma membrane that may not otherwise be able to pass through. Right, so you can form channels with these membrane proteins, transmembrane proteins. You also have carrier proteins, which integral proteins bind, change shape, directly transport substances into and out of the cell. Right, so these certain proteins will bind to certain substances. They'll change shape and allow that substance to be imported in. So it's a little bit different from the channel, which sort of, once the channel is open, the substance can just flow through, versus a carrier protein, which actually the substance binds to that protein, and then the protein actually changes shape to allow it to come through. We're going to see this a lot. Receptors. This happens a lot in the nervous system, especially, where we have the protein channel binds to what we call a ligand, a chemical messenger, a ligand. That ligand triggers that protein channel to open and allows certain chemicals or certain substances into or out of the cell. So it has receptors. Some of these proteins, these integral proteins can act as receptors for a specific ligand, a specific substance that will bind to that protein, cause it to open, and now something can flow freely. And then when it no longer is bound by this ligand, this channel will close. This integral protein will close off this channel, and now that substance won't be able to flow in. This is very important in cell-to-cell communication, which we're going to talk about when we talk about the nervous system, coming up in chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14, and 15, and 15 as well. Enzymes. Remember, enzymes are proteins. They speed up chemical reactions. We have some enzymes that are embedded in the plasma membrane. They bind to substrates, to chemical reactants that are going to react. Remember, enzymes allow them to much more likely to react because it brings them closer together. So now they're much in closer proximity instead of just floating around inside or outside the cell. Therefore, they're more likely to react. So some of these proteins, these integral proteins that are embedded in the plasma membrane, act as enzymes. We also have structural support. Some of the cytoskeleton is bound to the proteins that are embedded in the plasma membrane, helps give the cell some shape. When we say cholesterol, lipids, cholesterol, glycolipids, glycoproteins, but especially when we say cholesterol, don't always think of something negative as cholesterol. We think of cholesterol, we think of clogging the arteries and causing hypertension, high blood pressure, heart attack, myocardial infarctions, those things. Cholesterol, that's not the only cholesterol that we're talking about when we're talking about cholesterol. In this case, Um, you've probably heard of good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, those kinds of things. So cholesterol, which is a lipid, remember we talked about that as a lipid, um, can stabilize the plasma membrane's fluid structure during temperature changes. So we will have cholesterol embedded in the plasma membrane. We also have glycolipids and glycoproteins, carbohydrates bound to either a lipid or protein. Those help identify. Remember I said the cells don't have cell phones. I just thought about that. If the cell had a phone, it would be a cell phone. Okay, maybe not so funny, but they don't have that to identify themselves. But carbohydrates, as you kind of see here in this drawing, this diagram, carbohydrates and glycoproteins can help identify. So they provide like an identification of a specific cell. Oh, we know this is this cell because it has this structure sort of bound to the protein or to a lipid embedded in the plasma membrane.